Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today we are talking about the ontological argument with two philosophers. In the title of this, I call them baby philosophers. And there's a reason for that, because they're actually both really young, but they're both just super intelligent. And I want to say I'm definitely friends with Joe, but Alex, would you say that you and I are friends? I mean, I that's what I want to say.
But of course.
But of course.
Absolutely.
He said that so elegantly, too.
All right, don't you think we're friends?
Oh yeah, I mean that's what I said. I said I think we're friends, but I don't know if you would consider us friends.
So Cameron, what are we? Are we gonna have that chat right now?
We're best friends. First of all,
what are we?
I mean, I think we're best friends. That's what I think.
Yeah,
well, let's get to the topic. So we're talking about the ontological argument. We're going to explain what that is, and the reason why we're discussing this topic is because actually recently Joe submitted a paper for review. It's currently under review, if I understand that correctly, Joe. And so unfortunately, you guys aren't going to be able to watch. You aren't going to be able to read his paper, the ideas that are in the paper themselves, but we're going to discuss some of those ideas here. So in this paper, he defends the ontological argument against a really common objection. And so that's basically what the plan is today, is that Alex is going to push back. We're just going to have a really good dialogue about the ontological argument. But before we jump into the actual dialogue, I want to give my two guests, Joe and Alex, just a moment to tell you guys who they are if you don't know. And then I've got both of their YouTube channels linked in the description of this video, so go check them out for sure. But let's start with Alex. Alex, for anyone watching this who doesn't know who you are, who are you? And he's frozen. So while we're waiting for Alex to get Joe, why don't you start? We'll switch to you. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, like you said, I'm Joe. I do both popular and scholarly level work in philosophy. I have a YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason, where I do lecture videos in philosophy, particularly philosophy of religion and metaphysics. I also have philosophers on my channel like Josh Rasmussen, Rob Coons. I'm also getting Trenton Merrick's on in August, so I'm really excited for that. And on the scholarly level, I have my book, and let's see if I can point backwards. Is it up there? No, I did it wrong. Okay, so pointing backwards, that's my book, Majesty of Reason. And then I also publish various papers in peer-reviewed journals. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you've did you mention your YouTube channel? Sorry, I was focused on Alex getting back in the show. Did you mention your YouTube channel?
I think I did. Yeah, Majesty of Reason.
Okay,
if y'all want to check it out.
Yeah, which is one of the coolest YouTube names that you could even come up with. Way cooler than Cosmic Skeptic. But Alex, tell everyone who you are. Welcome back to the show. Who are you?
I hope I'm audible, because I was just having some problems.
Yes,
I think I must have disconnected, so now I'm just hotspotting on my phone. So sorry if I disappear again.
No worries.
Yeah, I'm Alex, and I'm an atheist YouTuber. Although I don't know. I mean, I recently flirted with the idea that, I recognize that in the context of academic philosophy, where I work mostly, is like the area I like to think that I work in. Atheism tends to be defined as the belief that there is no God, although colloquially speaking among my friends and colleagues, it seems to be a lack of belief in God. And so call me whatever you like. I generally, to bridge the divide, call myself an agnostic atheist YouTuber. So yeah, that's what I do. I make videos about that. And then I nag people for eating meat as well. More recently is another mantle that I've taken up. That's about it. That's all there is to me.
That's all. Literally, that's everything you need to know about Alex. So let's start. I want to jump right into the dialogue about the ontological argument. So I've titled this. I've just got the little thing. I'm bad at this too, Joe. On this side of me, is God's existence possible? And so yeah, let's start with talking just about, give an overview of what the ontological argument is. Let me also mention this. One of the reasons why this is the topic because Alex and Joe and I, we were talking about like what topics could we actually focus on in a dialogue between the two of them. And we settled on this one because, Alex, I know that you've mentioned several times in your videos and also just personally that like the ontological argument is an argument that you kind of take seriously. You like to think about it. I mean, obviously you don't think that it works, but nevertheless, you think that it's like an important argument in some way. So I just thought that it was a good topic. We all basically agreed that it was a good topic. Do you want to say anything about that? Just some thoughts that you've got on the ontological argument?
I think it's potentially the most fun of the arguments. It's just such a trip to just sit and do nothing but think. There's no kind of researching, no evidence, no looking at statistics or anything like that. You just sit there and talk it through, and then you think, well, how about we define this word this way and see where that leads us? And before you know it, you get a eureka moment, and a problem with the previous version no longer exists. And I just find it absolutely fascinating that you can just sit and do that in your brain. I find it crazy to think that it's at least conceivable, and a lot of philosophers seem to think it's conceivable, to prove or establish the existence of God through pure reason alone. And that if it can be done, I'd like to know about it, because it seems the most kind of low effort way to come to theism, because I can do it from my armchair. So if it's possible, I'd like to know about it. That's why I'm here.
Cool. So then why don't we get into, and Joe, feel free to, like, if you want to say anything else. I know that we kind of talked about, like, how should we structure the beginning of this as we set everything up. So let's just get an overview of the ontological argument, introduce whatever terms you want, whatever other important little distinctions, whatever you want to make. But let's just give an overview of the argument, and then we'll turn to some of the things that you've said recently in defense of it.
All right,
and keep in mind that let me mention this one last thing before we start, is that Alex, he's already he's already mentioned that he's an atheist. And sorry, Joe, and now Joe's gone.
Oh. Well.
So what I was going to mention, and Joe doesn't have to be around for me to say this, but I was just going to say that Joe is an agnostic. And so that kind of makes this whole dialogue between the two of them interesting, because we're talking about the ontological argument. It's an argument for theism, yet Joe is still an agnostic. Alex is an atheist. And then also Joe has defended the argument in print recently. Again, it's under review. So we'll see where that goes. Let me see if I can pull up while we're waiting for Joe to get back. Here we go. Just me and Alex. How's it going?
Just the two of us. Then
Just
there were
the two of us.
Best friends. Yeah. I'm sure that I was quite impressed with Joe's paper. He was kind enough to send it over to me, and it's an interesting argument that I hope we get to discuss. But we've talked so far as if there's only one such thing as there's only one ontological argument that exists. It's of course worth noting that there are many quite different versions that work very differently and require different kinds of assumptions and different forms of thinking. And recently I've been talking to a friend of mine. His name's Ryan. He has a YouTube channel called Maximally Great Philosophy, which I really just want to steal for a podcast. And he came practically raving to me recently. He's just got on to a PhD under Yujin Nagasawa. Is that how you say his name? Yujin Nagasawa, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to have him on my show, actually.
And fantastic. I mean, I'm a big fan of his work. And he came to me, and he'd been talking about the MOA for the longest time. And he came to me recently and said, you know what? I've been revisiting Anselm, and he was right all along. We've all just completely misunderstood him. And you know what? Fair play to him. He did actually make me rethink the thing. I think that Anselm's version has a lot more credit than a lot of people tend to give it credit for, including my former self. I was quite pleased to find that there's kind of a way to respond to parody objections. All this is to say that we don't have to restrict our discussion to the modal ontological argument, although that seems to be the one that everyone thinks is, if one's going to work, it's going to be that one.
Yeah.
But I'm not so sure. I don't know. I'm actually, at this point, I think I'm more attracted to Anselm's version than I am to the MOA.
Interesting.
But I don't really know.
All right. Looks like Joe is actually joining us again. Let me see if I can pull him in the scene. Joe, can you hear everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. He's back.
Annoying. That's frustrating, but okay. I came back quickly, so,
You did. And we've had about 1,000 different technical issues, so it's totally cool. Let's do this. So Alex and I were just talking about basically the fact that there are different versions. He also said some nice things about Anselm's version, at least a defense of Anselm's version of the argument from a friend of his. So let's turn it over to Joe and give us an overview of the argument to get us going into what you said recently in defense of it.
All right. Yeah. So an ontological argument roughly is just sort of like an armchair proof or armchair argument for God's existence. And what that means is that we're trying to justify a conclusion a priori. So that's just independently of some kind of experience of the world, say. And it's an argument for God's existence based on, among other things, perhaps God's nature or the concept of God, or maybe the nature of existence or perfection, or perhaps God's possibility. Okay, so that's an ontological argument. Now, the ontological argument that we're going to be focusing on today is the modal ontological argument. And so we have to talk a little bit about modality. So modality concerns the study of possibility, necessity, contingency, impossibility, things like that. And I just want to make a quick threefold distinction between different kinds of possibility before we get going, because it's really important. So the first kind of possibility is logical possibility. So logical possibility is just consistency in terms of something's like logical form or structure. So long as it isn't of the form A and not A, so like there are dogs and there are no dogs, or so long as it doesn't entail something of that form, then the proposition in question or the being in question is going to be logically possible. And so that's basically just a matter of not involving or entailing a strict contradiction. The second kind of possibility that I want to talk about is metaphysical possibility. So metaphysical possibility, it's hard to define, but it's roughly what genuinely can be true or can obtain in reality. And so it not only must respect logical consistency, but it also has to respect the natures of things. So for instance, maybe there's something in the very nature of causation that nothing can cause itself, even though there might not be anything strictly inconsistent of the form A and not A that follows from that. So that's metaphysical possibility, and there are different accounts of what metaphysical possibility consists in, but we can think of it as what genuinely could obtain, what genuinely could be in reality. And then finally, epistemic possibility. So epistemic possibility is basically just consistency with what we know to be true about the world. So for all I know, something might be the case, so for all I know, it might be raining in, I don't know, Tanzania right now. And that's possible epistemically speaking, and it's also possibly false epistemically speaking. And moreover, like Goldbach's conjecture, right? So these things can come apart. Presumably, Goldbach's conjecture is going to be necessarily true, if true at all. That's a conjecture in mathematics. But nevertheless, no one has a proof of it yet, so we don't quite know. It's like epistemically possible that it's true or false, but it's necessarily true or false one way or the other. And so there's a kind of, these can disentangle from one another. Okay, so that's modality. And then I guess the final concept before I get into the argument itself is possible worlds. So possible worlds, that's just a complete or total or global way that reality could be. I used it just as a kind of semantic or heuristic device, not trying to like ontologically commit to the robust existence of these like concrete universes or anything like that. And then God as well. So God, as I define it, is just going to be some kind of ultimate, independent, necessarily existent, perfect being. And by necessary, I mean metaphysically necessary. So that's what I mean by God. And so then we can get into the modal ontological argument. It's pretty simple. I'm just going to give the simplest version of it.
Joe.
It goes something, yeah.
Yeah, so before you give the actual version, I want to give Alex an opportunity to come in because we've talked about what modality and then possible worlds. Is there anything that you'd like to add, clarify, anything you'd like to say, Alex?
No, I mean, I think it was a good description. I think it's worth perhaps adding that we can represent we can represent certain things in. So if I wanted to say, for instance, that something is possible, the way that would be represented in modal talk would be to say that it is true in a possible world. To say that it's necessarily true is to say that it's true in all possible worlds. To say that it's impossible is to say that it's true in no possible worlds. I think that's worth, for anybody for whom this is the first introduction to modal logic, it's useful to recognize that they can be used interchangeably. So there is a possible world in which my shirt is red. That would be kind of the language that we use. It wouldn't be something like, oh, it's possible that in some world my shirt is red. That's kind of the way we're representing things. That there is a possible world, again, as Joe says, not an actual physical world somewhere like a multiverse, but rather a maximally consistent logical state of affairs that could obtain in which everything is as it is right now, except my shirt is red. But there's no possible world in which there's a married bachelor. There's no possible world in which there's a square circle, for instance. I think it's just worth adding that that's a kind of, that's how we're going to use the terms linguistically, I think.
Joe?
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. So that was good. And then, so yeah, cool. The argument would just be, oh yeah, what were you going to say?
I just said cool.
Oh, okay. So yeah, the argument would go something like, premise one, possibly God, as I just described it, exists. Conclusion, therefore God exists. It sounds tricky, but that follows from a system of modal logic called system S5. And in fact, you can actually get that inference with weaker systems as well, but that gets really complicated. But S5 is just, yeah, it's a system of modal logic which just dictates what follows from what and how the kind of operators within modality interchange with one another. So, the operators like possibility, so that's like a diamond. So possibly P, that would be like diamond P. Necessarily P, that would be like box P, and so on. So these systems of modal logic just basically tell you how you can go from various like combinations of operators to other combinations of operators. And so with system S5, it has a kind of distinctive axiom. And that distinctive axiom is if something is possible, well, then it's necessarily possible. And that actually entails that if something's possibly necessary, well, then it's actually necessarily the case. The entailment there is a little bit complicated, but yeah, if people want to like email me and ask me for the derivation, I think Josh Rasmussen has a derivation on his website of it, and it's also online and encyclopedias and whatnot. But anyway, so you can get from system S5 that if something is possibly necessarily the case, then you can shave off that possibility operator. It simply is necessarily the case. And since necessity entails actuality, right? If something's necessarily true, well, then it's obviously actually true. Or necessarily existent, then it's obviously actually existent. You can get the conclusion that God actually exists, right? Because if it's possible that God exists, given that God's a necessary being as I defined him, it follows that it's possibly necessary that God exists. Given system S5, you can shave off that possibility operator. So it's necessary that God exists, in which case it's actual that God exists. So that's the basic form of the argument. Now, I could pause here, or I could spell out the symmetry worry. I'll just turn it over to you to see what you want to do there.
Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Oh, yeah, all sounds fine to me. A lot of kind of words being thrown around, and I hope that everybody manages to follow. There's a lot of new terminology for anybody who's new to this. It might be worth thinking of it in terms of, I remember way back when I first heard about this argument, I basically misunderstood the point, right? Because the argument is something to the effect of, if something is possibly the case, then it's true in a possible world, as I said before. If it's possibly necessary, that is to say, because if something's possibly the case, it's true in a possible world. If it's possibly necessarily the case, then there's a possible world in which it's necessary. But if something's necessary, it's either true in all possible worlds or no possible worlds. So if it's possibly true, that means it's true in a possible... If it's possibly necessarily true, it means it's necessarily true in at least one possible world. And so it must be true in all possible worlds. A useful analogy for people who think that feels like a bit of a trick or isn't really saying anything is to say it's a lot like, and I can't remember who to attribute this to, but it's a lot like looking at a house and knowing that there's only one light switch for the whole house. That is to say, either all of the lights are on or all of the lights are off. And there's only one window open, that is the bathroom window or something. And you can only see that the bathroom window is open, that the bathroom light is on. But from that, you can derive that that every single room in the house must be lit up. It's a similar kind of thing. Just by saying that there's any possible world in which something is necessarily true, that just means that it must be necessarily, that means it must be true in all possible worlds, that is to say. I just want to spell that out because obviously this is the basis of the discussion. So I want to make sure that everybody is with us on that.
So yeah. What were you scribbling just now?
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you noticed that. Okay, so we could represent possible worlds as like little circles. Let me see if I can move this up. Yeah. Okay, so little circles. Let's say that like, okay, let me draw an actuality. So this little at right here, that is the actual world. And so if we're saying that something is possibly necessary, we're saying, hey, it's possibly the case. So in some other possible world, say, we're going to move to that. It's possibly the case that something is necessary. So this is a world where we're locating the thing that's necessary. So there's something that's necessary there. But wait a second. If it's necessarily existent, right, that means that that thing in there is in all possible worlds, right? And so then you can actually take you from there to this. That thing is actually in all possible worlds. So our space of possible worlds is actually filled by it, right? So we went from... in the actual world here, we said that it's possibly the case that something is necessary. So we went to that possible world where that necessary thing exists. And then we're like, oh, hey, wait a second. It's necessarily existent, which means it spans all worlds, right? So then you can go here and then you get it spans all worlds. Now that does assume system S5, but yeah, a lot of philosophers think that S5 does accurately capture metaphysical possibility. And I should emphasize that the argument that we're talking about here is indeed cast in terms of metaphysical possibility. We're not saying like, oh, for all I know, God might exist, or for all I know, God might not exist. No, we're saying premise one is that it's metaphysically possible. There is some possible world, some way that reality could be such that God exists. And then from there, you do get the God necessarily exists. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is one of the first weaknesses or rather kind of ways that the rug gets pulled under people is that when you ask them to accept the first premise, it's possible that God exists, most people say, yeah, I can agree with that in the sense of epistemic humility. Like, yeah, sure, it's possible that God exists, but that's not we have to be careful to specify that we're talking about metaphysical possibility, right? So, for example, if you're somebody who thinks, if you think to yourself, well, yeah, I mean, I think it's possible that God exists, that means God must exist. Like, that doesn't seem right. Like, if you are of the mind, if when you say you think God possibly exists, you mean it in the sense of saying, well, possibly God exists, possibly God doesn't exist, I don't know. That's not the kind of possibility that we need for this argument to work. If you are talking about metaphysical possibility and you say, well, it's possible that necessarily God exists, it's possible that necessarily he doesn't. It's like, no, you can't have both at the same time. It's one or the other. So one of the ways that I think, one of the first mistakes I think that a lot of people make is they kind of go, well, yeah, I mean, the first premise seems reasonable. It's possible that God exists. But there are different types of possibility, as Joe very helpfully spelled out. And so if you're just thinking, epistemically speaking, like, yeah, it could be true, don't worry, that doesn't quite commit you to the conclusion. But if you think it's metaphysically possible, then unfortunately you are committed.
Yeah, this has been super helpful. And I think that, Joe, especially your little scribble right there actually was really helpful. Maybe we can refer back to it in just a little bit. So yeah, let's talk about one of the main objections, and this is one of the objections that led me away from thinking that the ontological argument was a sound argument, or not well, so I'm a theist, so I believe that the premise is true, that it's possible that God exists, but whether an argument is sound is distinct from whether it's a good and sort of persuasive argument to people that don't already accept the premises of the argument. So, and this is one of the objections that led me there. It's called the reverse ontological argument. So, Joe, I'm going to pass it back over to you and inform us on what this objection is.
Yeah, so like Alex just said, right, you can't have your possibility claims both ways when we're talking about metaphysical possibility, especially when we're talking about, well, actually only when we're talking about necessary beings, right, necessary truths. You can't say it's possibly true and possibly false under S5 modal logic, the one that we're operating in here. A necessary being is going to be either necessary or impossible. You can't say that it's both possibly true or possibly existent and also possibly not true or possibly not existent. So there's this reverse problem, which is what you're pointing to. And again, this is the biggest problem in the literature. And it's that, hey, we can just run an exactly symmetrical argument with the opposite conclusion. Here's the argument. Premise 1, possibly God doesn't exist. And so from that, you actually get that God doesn't exist, right? If it's possibly true that God doesn't exist, well, that actually means that, returning to this, right, because we're in the actual world, now we can imagine that this like little black dot is the world in which the necessary being is absent, right? So if we have the actual world here and it's possibly the case that the necessary being is absent, well, hold on a second. If there were a necessary being, it would span all worlds, right? And so if the necessary being is absent in one of the worlds, it simply can't be in any of the worlds, right? Because if it were to be in any one of the worlds, it would be in all of them, as we showed, right? You go from here to here, but in that case, if there's one absent, then you can just shave them all off, okay? So you can go from the possible non-existence of God to the actual non-existence of God, and indeed the impossibility of God. And so that is the reverse ontological argument. And it's symmetrical, right? This is a problem because those first two premises, they seem like epistemically on par, right? There doesn't, like, without giving some kind of independent argument, no one should just privilege one of those premises over the other without some kind of independent reason. That would just be arbitrary. I mean, one of them says possibly God exists, the other one says possibly God doesn't exist. And it would seem arbitrary, absent some kind of further considerations, to just like foot stomp and privilege one of them over the other. So that's the biggest problem, essentially. It's like, yeah, the argument doesn't give you any reason to go one way or the other, precisely because there's this perfectly symmetrical objection argument as well. And so that actually spawns the need, and I'll pause here, that spawns the need for symmetry breakers. A symmetry breaker tries to justify one possibility premise at the expense of another one. And so it thereby tries to break that symmetry between the modal ontological argument and the reverse modal ontological argument. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, Alex, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's just worth adding maybe that Alvin Plantinga, who is credited with formulating the modal ontological argument, himself recognizes this problem and doesn't claim that the modal ontological argument works as an argument to establish the existence of God to an atheist. He's only seeking to establish what he refers to as a rational warrant for Christianity. That is, if you are a Christian, he thinks it's rational to accept the premise that possibly God exists, and therefore it's rational to accept the conclusion that God does exist. But it can also be rational to accept that God possibly doesn't exist, and therefore he doesn't exist. So for Plantinga, for the actual argument's origin, it's not strictly supposed to be an argument that establishes God existence. It's just a way to say that I'm at least rationally warranted in some sense. I think that's a bit of a cop-out. I think that's a bit of a weak thing to say. But obviously, we're not here to discuss Plantinga's views, because as long as we can find a symmetry breaker, then we can do one better than Plantinga. And that's kind of seems to me the holy grail of the ontological argument discussion, is to find some kind of functional symmetry breaker. But this is the one thing that the ontological argument is good at doing, because I'm with Cameron on this. That is to say, you basically got two breezes equally pushing against each other. But it at least reduces the debate. The debate is no longer, God exists versus God doesn't exist. It seems like it's much weaker now. It's between God possibly exists and God possibly doesn't exist. We recognize these aren't actually compatible. That seems like a much more modest thing to be arguing about. So I think it's got that strength going for it. The conclusion that we now need from a good argument is just that God possibly exists, not that God exists, because we've got this argument to take us that step further.
Yeah, so why don't we at this point, because we're about at the half-hour mark, so why don't we turn now to Joe, your recent paper that, again, is under review, so I apologize you guys can't read it, but we can at least talk about the ideas that Joe presents in his paper. So he presents a symmetry breaker. And for those of you that are having trouble following along, first of all, you're watching a video titled Ontological Argument. So there's going to be stuff like this that we've got to discuss. So symmetry breaker, one last time, just to reiterate, is basically some type of consideration in favor of one of these possibility premises. Okay, so in the regular modal ontological argument, first premise, at least the simplified version, it's possible that God exists. And in the reverse, it's possible that God doesn't exist. And so we need some reason to, Joe, how did you say it? We need some reason to privilege one possibility premise over the other one. And so what Joe has done in this paper, even though he's an agnostic, and so you can probably tell that he's got some reasons to think that this symmetry breaker doesn't ultimately work in the end, but he's nevertheless defended one in print, and he's going to defend it against Alex right now, and we're just going to have a really good dialogue about it. So Joe, tell us what your symmetry breaker is. This was one of the first questions I asked Joe. I was like, well, which way are you going with the symmetry breaker? Are you going toward atheism or are you going toward theism? So which way is it going? And then, just spell it out for us.
Yeah, so the symmetry breaker is indeed trying to favor the theistic possibility premise over and above the non-theistic or atheistic possibility premise. And one kind of worry that I want to spell out that people should keep in mind when they're thinking about symmetry breakers is a lot of times when someone tries to offer a symmetry breaker for one of the premises, they oftentimes don't realize that it kind of bites them back in the butt, as it were, and it actually supports the other possibility premise as well. So, some people will appeal to like conceivability. Well, I can conceive of God existing, but it's like, it's also, I can surely also conceive of, say, naturalism being true, or, it's at least conceivable, conceptually possible that naturalism is true, or that there would be like a world filled with gratuitous evil, say, or, filled with some kind of thing that would be incompatible with God's existence. So I don't think conceivability or things like that are going to work. So that's why I want to try to find one that doesn't ultimately, bite both ways. And so mine is what I call an explanatory symmetry breaker for the original modal ontological argument. And so I begin by focusing on what I call existential facts, okay? Now, those are just true propositions about the existence of concrete things. So concrete things, that's like a table and a chair and you and me and God and Cartesian egos or Cartesian demons if they exist. It's just anything with some kind of causal power. And we can call these concrete things just like things or objects or beings for short. And so again, an existential fact is just a true proposition or some fact about the existence of concrete things. So an existential fact, an example would be turtles exist, or tables exist, or my house exists, or something like that. And so I take existential facts, again, to have the abstract form, the X's exist, or X exists. And so I begin the paper by looking at a kind of strong explanatory principle. And I call it the principle of explanation, or PE for short. And in rough sketch, it says that, hey, all else being equal, existential facts have an explanation, okay? More precisely, I kind of spell out that explanation in different ways. Now, I say that every existential fact, according to PE, is explained by some other fact, which includes the existence of some concrete thing that is not among the concrete things specified in the first existential fact. That's abstract. I'll take it more concrete now. So pick any existential fact you like, that there are turtles, say, okay? According to PE says that, hey, that existential fact, that there are turtles, that's going to be explained by some further fact that includes a concrete thing not among the concrete things in that original fact. So it's going to include the explanation, that is, of there being turtles. It's going to include some concrete thing that is not a turtle, right? And that just seems intuitive, right? How could you have an explanation of turtles, why there are turtles as such, why there are any turtles at all, in terms of a turtle, right? You're presupposing the very thing you need to explain. So that's PE. It basically is saying that there's going to be existential facts have some outside explanation, and that explanation is going to include something that's not among the things being explained. Okay, that's the basic thrust of PE. Now, I do want to get some quick notes on the PE before going on to the main principle that generates my argument, which is the principle of possible explanation. So some notes on the PE. So first, PE doesn't like demand or require an existential or an explanation for existential
Sorry,
facts.
Joe. I think I'd like to slow down just for a second and get it. Alex, would you like to say anything or any kind of clarification type questions or before we move into?
It all sounds good to me. I mean, I've of course read the paper, so this is familiar.
Yeah,
but I
for
mean,
us,
it is gonna be very much, because it's quite a. I mean, you know, Joe's got a whole paper to describe, so I don't mind the fact that I'm just kind of sat back not saying much.
Oh yeah,
I'm
I'm
happy
going to
kind
be
of
brief. This won't be too long.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
fine.
okay.
I don't mind just letting you spell out the whole thing. I'll raise my hand if I've got any questions, maybe.
Okay. All right, continue, Joe.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just giving some notes on the PE before going to the main principle that drives my symmetry breaker. So we're not at my symmetry breaker yet. I'm laying the groundwork. So the first note that I want to make on PE is that it doesn't like demand or require an explanation for existential facts. It just says that an explanation exists, all else being equal. And what that means is just that there's a kind of defeasible presumption in favor of there being an explanation. Like, we should expect there to be an explanation unless we have some positive reason to think that there is no such explanation. We're justified in taking there to be an explanation unless we're given some positive reason to think otherwise. So it doesn't demand or require an explanation, unlike some causal principles and other cosmological arguments and things like that. I know we're not talking about cosmological arguments, but PE does not require an explanation. It just says that it exists, all else being equal. Okay, so that's the first note. The second note is that I'm only going to be concerned with these kinds of external or non-circular explanations, right? And that is explanations that don't presuppose the very thing being explained, right? Recall the example of the turtles that I gave. A condition on the explanation in PE is that it has to be a non-circular explanation. It has to be outside of the very thing being explained, right? You're not going to be able to explain the fact that there are turtles in terms of turtles, right? In terms of one turtle that begets them all, because you're already presupposing that that there are any turtles at all. So that's also another condition on explanation for my PE. And then the third and final note, before I get into the juicy stuff from my symmetry breaker, is that I'm going to be stipulating that an explanation of an existential fact itself includes a concrete thing. So it's going to include the either activity, like the grounding activity or the causing activity or the functional realizing activity. It's going to include some kind of explanatory activity of a concrete thing. So for instance, returning to the turtles, right? Various factors in an evolutionary process that were prior to turtles, including various concrete things and certain selection pressures on them, that explains why there are any turtles at all. And so those are my notes on PE. And so I'm just going to very briefly, just like, why would someone find PE plausible? Well, I mean, it does seem kind of intuitive in its own right. I mean, like, yeah, I mean, things generally just seem to have explanations. I mean, how could there be, like there being turtles, say, that are inexplicable? Moreover, it seems to track philosophical and scientific practice, right? I mean, both philosophers and scientists, like even when like we don't have an explanation readily available, they nevertheless take it that there is an explanation, even though it's as yet undiscovered. And moreover, this principle enjoys a kind of abundant inductive and experiential support, right? I mean, look around. A lot of these existential facts, like that my house exists, or that my table exists, or that my computer exists, they have outside explanations in terms of facts that cite concrete things that brought them about or that account for them. So that's, and we also might think that like the truth of PE best explains this kind of uniform and widespread inductive and experiential support that we have for it. Okay, so that's the PE. We're going to set that aside, and that sets the stage for my symmetry breaker. Okay, so I consider in the paper a logically weaker principle than PE. That doesn't mean that it's not as dialectically strong. In fact, it's less vulnerable to criticism and hence dialectically stronger, precisely because it's a logically weaker principle. It doesn't demand as much about reality. So the rough sketch of this principle, the principle of possible explanation, or PPE, the rough sketch of it is that existential facts possibly have an explanation, all else being equal, right? So remember P, it said existential facts have an explanation, all else being equal. PPE says existential facts possibly have an explanation, all else being equal. And so a little bit more precise way to put that is that every existential fact is possibly explained by another fact, which includes the existence of something that's not among the things reported in the first fact that we're trying to explain. And all else being equal. So unlike PE, again, PPE concerns merely possible explanation. And so why might one think that PE is plausible? I just have I'm just going to briefly talk about the motivations for PPE, and then I'll spell out why it's a symmetry breaker, and then we'll turn it over to Alex. So maybe just about 90 more seconds or something. So stick with us. So the reasons favoring PE plausibly favor PPE as well, right? I mean, PE, for instance, entails PPE. And there also seem to be distinctive, modal epistemological tools that support PPE. So, you can pick some existential fact, an explanation for which we don't have positive reason to think is impossible. Well, an explanation for that fact is surely, 1, consistent and coherent, 2, conceivable, even under close inspection, and thirdly, compatible with, the known natures and essences of things. And moreover, we know that many facts about, the existence of things, we know that many of them are actually explained, and hence possibly explained, and arguably there's going to be some kind of defeasible presumption in favor of the uniformity of this modal property of being possibly explained across the class of facts reporting the existence of things. Josh Rasmussen has actually developed this about modal uniformity. A lot of you have probably heard Josh talking about that on Cameron's channel even. And so plausibly, these various modal epistemological considerations, in addition to the various reasons favoring PE, give us defeasible reason to think that a given existential fact is at least possibly explained in the manner of explanation that I cited earlier, all else being equal. Okay, so that's my justification or brief defense of PPE. And now we can turn to the symmetry breaker. So how does PPE break symmetry? So by PPE, right, the existential fact that there are imperfect beings, and by imperfect beings, I mean beings that are not perfect, beings that are not God. By PPE, that existential fact is possibly explained, all else being equal. And so we can call the existential fact that there are imperfect beings, we can call that imperfect fact, okay? And so now we're going to consider a world in which imperfect fact is explained. Well, by PPE, the principle includes a concrete thing. We can call that concrete thing T, okay? By the non-circularity of explanation, right, T is not going to be among any of the imperfect things in the world that we're considering, right? Because if it were, then we'd have a circular explanation. We're trying to explain why there are imperfect things in that world. But every concrete thing is either imperfect, that is, not perfect, or else it's perfect. And so since T is a concrete thing that's not among the perfect things in that world, it follows that T is perfect in that world. And so there's a possible world in which a perfect being exists. And in that case, a perfect being possibly exists. And by the modal ontological argument, it follows that a perfect being exists, all else being equal. Remember that ceteris paribus clause, or ceteris paribus clause, the all else being equal clause, that's throughout this. And so in other words, we have defeasible reason to think that a perfect being exists. And that's an explanatory symmetry breaker, right? Because it supports the possibility premise in the modal ontological argument for theism over the possibility premise in the reverse modal ontological argument. Because when we apply the PPE to imperfect fact, that fact earlier, that gives us a possible concrete thing that is perfect. And so essentially, PPE is going to give us this kind of symmetry breaker. It is a defeasible symmetry breaker. It doesn't prove God exists. It's defeasible. You could give some kind of positive reason to think that there couldn't be an explanation in this case. But it does give us some weight of a reason to think that God is indeed possible, and hence actual, over and above the possibility premise of the reverse argument. All right, so that concludes my summary.
Okay, so now we're ready for Fuzzy Alex to come in. I say Fuzzy Alex because it looks like his internet. Something's going on. We've had 1,000 technical issues, but I think that everyone should be able to hear you nevertheless. So what would you like to say in response? That was a lot, but where would you like to begin?
Well, do let me know if there are any problems. I suppose audio is the main thing. I can try switching back to the other Wi-Fi. I'm currently hotspotting off my phone. Okay, so yeah, there was a lot there, but I think you'll agree, everybody listening, that it was wonderfully put. It seems to me that this kind of explanatory symmetry breaker is going to fail if either the same kind of considerations could support the reverse modal ontological argument, or if there were like other or better reasons, even separate reasons, to support the impossibility premise, or I should say the possibly not existent God premise, than the reasons that this gives to support the possibility premise. I think realistically, it's not so much that I have any strict objections, but more clarifications that I'd like to make. For example, when I was reading the paper, Joe, one thing that kept coming back that I wasn't sure about is how you understand necessary beings. Some people describe necessary beings as those which explain themselves. Some would characterize them as those which have no explanation. I don't know which you'd favor.
Yeah,
or if you have a
I
different
think it's
view entirely.
Yeah, so in terms of definitions, right, I'd leave open whether or not they have an explanation. I would say that a necessary being is just a being that exists in all possible worlds. So it cannot fail to exist. It must exist. In terms of the explanation, I don't think that anything can explain itself. I think something would already have to exist in order to have any explanatory power in the first place, in which case it can't explain why it exists. It'd be like bootstrapping itself up into existence, as it were. And so I tend to think that that's impossible. But I do think that, some necessary beings could be, in principle, explained. So, like, a lot of philosophers think that you can generate the numbers by set theory, right? You start with the empty set, say, and then you can build a set theoretic hierarchy. In that case, there's a sense in which the later elements in the set theoretic hierarchy are like dependent on the earlier elements, and they're somehow explained by them. And so I leave open whether or not like necessary things could be explained.
Sure. Okay. I wanted, just because you did say quite assertively that nothing can explain itself, and I wonder where that would leave us with necessary beings. I suppose it would commit you to the view that necessary beings have an explanation outside of themselves, or have no explanation, one or the other. I'd imagine that in the instance of God, the kind of foundation of all things, if he does exist, it would be strange to say that he has an explanation that exists outside of himself. I think that would diminish his perfection, in fact. And so I think you're probably committed to saying that God exists without any explanation.
Yeah, so, well, it depends, right? So I wouldn't make generalizations about necessary beings as such, because I think we would, like the set theoretic hierarchy, those things would be necessary beings, but a lot of them would presumably be dependent if sets exist. But in terms of God, yeah, if I were a theist, I would, rather emphatically say that God is uniquely the only thing that doesn't have this kind of non-circular explanation, precisely because he's the foundation, he's the source of everything. And we have principled reasons to think, that he doesn't have an explanation. You could talk about his perfection and his ultimacy and his aseity and so on. So.
To be clear, you say that God would be, from the theist perspective, putting the theist hat on, and I'm probably going to just treat you like you're a theist. I sometimes just forget, given the nature of the conversation. You say that God would be the one thing that has no, or one of the things, I suppose, that uniquely has no non-circular explanation. Does that mean either that he has a circular explanation, or he has no explanation at all? Or would you remain agnostic on that point?
Yeah, so for the purposes of my paper, I stipulate that explanation is non-circular. If you want my personal view, I don't think any explanation could be circular in principle. So, I mean, if I'll be willing to, take that view here. I think that God is the only thing that in principle couldn't have an explanation, and and he can't be like self-explained, again, because I think something would already have to exist in order to have any explanatory power in the first place. Oh, I should say, for the audience, the kind of explanation we're talking about, philosophers distinguish between a kind of epistemic sense of explanation, where you're like removing mystery as to why something is the case, but there's also a more like ontological or metaphysical side of explanation, where there's some kind of connection between things in extramental reality, maybe some kind of dependence relation, like grounding or causing or something like that. But yeah, so philosophers make that distinction, and in this paper, I'm mainly concerned with the kind of metaphysical kind.
Sure. So we have We've kind of arrived at this idea that if this symmetry breaker works and we establish the existence of God, God would essentially exist as a being with no explanation. Now, it seems as though, I mean, and again, this is something you discuss in your paper, but I think maybe it's worth addressing, is this idea that the very principles that you put forward, the PE and the PPE, seem to lead to an absurdity. That is to say, if God possibly has an explanation, or if God has an explanation, or I should say, if everything has an explanation, then God would have an explanation himself. And this is where you stress that your principle is defeasible. It's like all other things being equal, we have reason to think that there is an explanation. With God, because of the fact that we see him as the ground of all, as this necessary being, and what we've discussed so far, that he wouldn't have an explanation, that kind of gives us reason to say that God is like exempt from this, right?
Yeah.
And would you say, I mean, it seems to me like, I don't know if I'd be able to come up with a good reason to think this, but is it at least plausible that the same kind of thing could apply to the imperfect fact, that it could be such a fact that just exists with no explanation? Or do you think there's, like, is it just a case that because there's no reason to think, because there's no like positive reason to think that the imperfect fact would be exempt, we'll assume that it's not exempt? Or is it rather you have positive reason to think that it's not exempt, if you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's good. So I think that whether someone has such a positive reason, it's going to depend on their position on the epistemic landscape, as it were. I mean, if someone has what they think is a decisive proof for atheism, say, like they think that a perfect being is incoherent, well, then, yeah, then they have some positive reason to think that imperfect fact cannot be explained, right? Because then that would entail that God exists. But they have this kind of independent proof, as it were. But what my symmetry
Yeah.
breaker allows is that if someone doesn't have that independent reason to think, some positive reason, some positive justification for thinking that imperfect fact cannot be explained, is inexplicable, then my symmetry breaker gives them some weight of a reason to move towards theism. And moreover, I mean, I think that even if they do have that positive reason, even if they do have that independent positive reason, that might still potentially, depending on how strong their reason is, that could still move them. It could sway their mind because they can recognize that, yeah, well, you're right, things do in general have explanations. And as a general rule of thumb, as a rule of inquiry, right, as rational inquiry, we tend to think that things have outside explanations. And so that could at least move them a little bit. But again, it depends on the strength of their reasons. But yeah, so I would say someone would need some kind of principled independent reason in order to debar imperfect fact from having an outside explanation. Now, in the case of God, we do have that independent reason given God's perfection. We could just see the nature of perfection entails ultimacy, I think. But yeah, anyway, for a neutral agnostic, they might not have any principled reason to think that imperfect fact has an outside explanation. Can't have an outside explanation.
One thing that might lead us to think this, that is to say, something that might lead us to support the RMOA, as I'll refer to the reverse modal ontological argument for everybody listening, because I know we're using a lot of initialisms, and I've sometimes briefly look over at the chat and people are just like, what is PE? What is PPE? So I'll try to specify as we go along. Do you think there's any? I mean, do you think there's any plausibility in these kinds of arguments that try to show some kind of incoherence in the concept of God? I mean, obviously, the most common that you hear is this so-called paradox of omnipotence, which I think can be dismissed fairly easily, right? The idea, can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Well, look, we're talking about a maximally powerful being here. We could either say that God can do all things and logical contradictions aren't things, they don't refer to anything. Or we could say that God is omnipotence just means the ability to do all logically possible things. But I mean, for instance, I'm just thinking now of a version that might be applied to something like omniscience, because the God that you define is a perfect being possessing all perfections, including that of omniscience. It seems to me that there's a bit of a problem that can't be solved in the same way. With omnipotence, it's fairly easy to do. But if God is omniscient, I think we can define that as God knowing all true propositions. That is, if there is a true proposition, then God knows that true proposition. This, to me, seems like it leads to a potential problem, potentially a paradox, potentially a problem with infinity. That is to say, if God knows that P, well, let's say P is true, then it follows that God knows P, if God is omniscient. God knows P then becomes a true proposition, right? Which means that God must also know that proposition. And that is to say that we're kind of creating new propositions. right? Every single time we make this step, and that's because it's a true proposition. It's one that God must know. This kind of problem comes up in human knowledge as well, right? Can you know something without knowing that you know it? But human beings aren't omniscient, so we can just say, and I think we have to say, that you can know things without knowing that you know them. So, for instance, you might have something, when there's something on the tip of your tongue, or something you didn't remember, somebody jogs your memory, and it's there, it's in there somewhere. You did know it, you just didn't know that you knew it. Right? But with an omniscient being, we run into this problem that as soon as God knows anything, and this could just be one proposition, that this microphone exists. God knows that this microphone exists, which creates a new proposition. That proposition is God knows the microphone exists. So we can say God knows that God knows the microphone exists. That itself is a true proposition. And so God must know that God must know that God must know, yada, yada, and so on and so forth. And this is the case. We create this infinite regress for a singular proposition. This microphone exists. So for every other proposition that is true as well, you end up with this infinite chain. And it seems to me that if God exists in a state, he's not like, there's some discussion to be had here between a potential and an actual infinity, but God isn't kind of like going through this one by one, kind of thinking about these propositions and thinking about the next one and thinking about the next one. He knows them all at once. And it seems to me that we have here a problem with infinity potentially. But I don't know what you think of that kind of line of thought. Because if that's true, if we think there's something paradoxical or contradictory, and contradictory might be too strong a term, but something at least troubling that gives us reason to think that this concept of omniscience, and therefore the concept of a perfect being that encapsulates it, is incoherent in a way that would make it impossible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I like it. It's interesting. So the first thing that I want to say, so I have roughly 3 remarks that I want to say. So first, we should note that my symmetry breaker, precisely in virtue of being defeasible, right? That's the kind of ceteris paribus clause, the all else being equal clause. That does allow for the symmetry breaker still to give some support to theism, but yet you still have these overriding defeaters, like if you think that this argument shows that God is impossible. So I think that this argument is compatible with my symmetry breaker. It's just that you would have some positive reason to think that imperfect fact can't be explained. So it would block the inference ultimately to God's existence, but I don't think it would block the success of the symmetry breaker, insofar as by symmetry breaker we just mean some consideration that does indeed favor the modal ontological argument vis-a-vis the reverse modal ontological argument, or in relation to it. So that's my first response. The second response is that I think God could, or I think in principle one might hold that God's knowledge is non-propositional. So this has historical precedent. Aquinas held it, for instance. A number of other authors have held it. More recently, William Lane Craig, Bill Alston, and others have held that God's knowledge is non-propositional. And God just has this kind of single intuitive grasp of all of reality, as it were. And so you're not kind of building these infinite hierarchies of propositions and whatnot, but instead God just has this simple intuitive gaze, as it were, of reality. And you can spell that out variously. You can get more precise and rigorous and so on. But that's the second thing that I want to note, is that there's an avenue out for the theist. And then the third thing that I want to say, and this is the final thing, is that I'm not sure that the regress you're describing, this kind of, there's this further proposition that God knows that he knows that P, and he knows that he knows that he knows that P, and so on. I don't quite see that as a vicious regress. So there's a distinction in philosophy between vicious regresses and non-vicious regresses. Sometimes they're called virtuous regresses, but we could just call them non-vicious. And a non-vicious regress, there are different ways to cast this distinction, but typically philosophers think that a vicious regress requires some kind of dependence, and like one thing, in order to be settled or in order to be the case, this other thing itself would have to be settled or be the case first. But yet that thing would have to be settled by some other further thing, and then so on ad infinitum. And so it's almost like you never get the original fact settled or accounted for, as it were. So that would be a vicious regress. It involves some kind of dependence. But the regress that you're specifying doesn't seem to involve this kind of like problematic dependence on infinitely many elements. I mean, we can just consider the proposition P, and then the proposition it is true that P, and then the proposition it is true that P, and then so on ad infinitum, right? This is a typical example in the literature of a non-vicious regress, because it's not as though you have one thing depending on infinitely many other things needing to be satisfied first. Rather, all the infinitely many depend on that first, more fundamental P. But similarly, God's knowing that he knows that P, like those are going to be dependent on that more fundamental fact. And so you don't have this kind of like dependence in the infinite direction. Rather, they all bottom out in this more fundamental fact. So it seems non-vicious, and so it seems non-problematic to me.
Yeah, that's the way that I would try to get out of it too. I think there's potentially a way of reframing the consideration. We could say something like, because we've been working on this principle that if P is true, then God knows P. But we could also say that like P can only be true if God knows P. Let's say like it's a requirement of P being true that God knows P. And then we've reframed it so it kind of works in the opposite direction. If P is true, well, that can only be the case if God knows that P, right? And that can only be true if God knows that P. Because as a principle of omniscience, if God is omniscient, something can only be true if God knows that it's true. So it seems that just by almost like redefining, it seems to me redefining in a way that's logically equivalent, but it would reframe it such that it would work in the other direction. Because if we say that a proposition is true if and only if God knows that it's true, then we seem to have the problem resurrected and working in the opposite direction, potentially. I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking of this now, but I mean, we would then be able to say something like P being true relies on the truth of the proposition God knows P, and that itself relies on the truth of the proposition God knows that God knows P, and so on and so forth. And then we do have a vicious regress.
Yeah. So, well,
Joe,
I know Cameron. Yeah.
Yeah, you can kind of tell. I just want to let people know that we're going to transition to some Q&A. We're right at about the hour mark, and we planned on doing some Q&A. We'll see how the conversation goes. We even talked about like if the conversation gets too interesting, we may just not do any questions. But I'll just let you guys know that we may transition to Q&A. So if you have questions for either Alex or Joe, leave it in the live chat. I'll be keeping an eye on it as we progress here. So yeah, I'll pass it back over to you, Joe.
Yeah, no, so that's good. And I like how you pointed out, like, yeah, hey, P is true only if God indeed knows that P, because God's omniscient. But that does still leave open the question of which way the direction of explanation goes, right? We still have the if and only if here. And so we still have the direction of explanation. So which way is it dependent? Which way is the direction of explanation? And I would say, knowledge is surely dependent on there being the fact there to be known, right? It's not as though something is true because someone knows about it. No. Their belief state gets to count as knowledge, in addition to them having justification, say, precisely because the fact is out there, right? It's a fact that P, and that is what accounts for or explains, in part, that's what part of what explains why the entity in question has knowledge. And so in that case, we actually do have the element, the bottom element, being the fact that P, and then we have a non-vicious dependence of God, not P, and knowledge knows. And so that the condition A needs to be satisfied, but oh wait, some further condition needs to be satisfied first,
Joe,
and so on ad infinitum. You don't have that structure here.
Joe, sorry, you cut in and out a little bit. Just repeat that last bit.
Okay, yeah. So I would just say precisely because knowledge is dependent on the facts themselves, we actually have the element, the fact out there, and then God's knowledge, his knowing that P, and then his knowing that P, and so on. That's a non-vicious regress dependent on that single foundational element, which is in contradistinction to a case wherein you have, say, some condition, and that condition needs to have satisfied before it, explaining it, infinitely many things. So,
yeah, I think you've expertly seen through my sophisms there. I wanted to make sure, because I think you're about right. Like that I would agree with you that the dependence must go that way. At least it seems to in our ordinary understanding of knowledge. You know something because it's true. It's not true because you know it. Maybe there's some room to discuss whether that's true in the case of an omniscient and omnipotent creator of the universe. There's some room, I think, there for discussion at least. But I think it's perhaps a less interesting point because we're not exactly talking strictly about your symmetry breaker here. We're just kind of talking about a way of concluding the opposite. So I want to probe a little bit here about this concept of a perfect being, because this is kind of the crux of the thing. This distinction between imperfect and perfect, and therefore, if there are imperfect things, there must be a perfect thing to explain them, or ultimately must be because there might be. So I want to know exactly, like, can we could we reframe this argument? It seems to me that the operative part of this perfect being is its metaphysical necessity. That's the part that makes this argument work, right? It's not the omnipotence, it's not the omniscience, it's none of that. The thing that makes this argument work is the fact that you have things which are not metaphysically necessary. That is to say, they're metaphysically contingent, and that if they have an explanation, that explanation must be metaphysically necessary, and therefore, if this group of imperfect things, which I think operatively can be switched out to just say this group of contingent things, has an explanation, possibly, then there's a possible world in which contingent things are explained, and therefore there's a possible world in which there would be a necessary thing. And we're essentially in the realm of cosmological arguments. We're kind of, that's the discussion we'd end up having. But like, would it be fair to essentially not use them interchangeably, but to say that that's kind of that's the crux of the perfect imperfect distinction that's relevant to the argument that you're making, is that a perfect being is metaphysically necessary, whereas imperfect things are metaphysically contingent?
Sort of. So I would say yes and no. So I agree that we can substitute things in for that, whatever fact that we're trying to explain, like that there are turtles, right? That then we wouldn't be able to infer a perfect being. We just have to infer that there's a non-turtle, or at least one non-turtle that explains why there are turtles. So the point is that yeah, we can intersubstitute things for the relevant existential fact. But I think the explanatory symmetry breaker will work whether or not we substitute only metaphysically contingent, and then yeah, you'd be able to defeasibly infer the existence of a metaphysically necessary thing. But given the generality of the principle of possible explanation, or PPE, you can likewise substitute in imperfect beings there. And that might include some necessary imperfect beings and also some contingent imperfect beings. So long as they're all uniformly imperfect, right? We can apply PPE to the case and defeasibly infer that there is indeed a perfect being. So, I mean, I understand like your point, right? We could just swap in and place that like contingent beings there, and then we'd be able to get a necessary being. But as a rule of thumb, right? Things are explained as far as we can, and so if this necessary thing is not perfect, if it's not unlimited, if it has these various arbitrary limits, to use Josh Rasmussen's phrase, if it has these various limits, well then we could still call out for some further explanation. We can still ask, hey, even if we have a necessary imperfect or limited thing as well, we can ask, why are there those imperfect limited things simpliciter? And we can get the explanatory symmetry breaker just by applying the PPE to that. So it's possibly the case that these things are non-circularly explained, and then we get to the perfect being. So it's similar to a cosmological argument. I recognize that because it has to do with explanation, but it still does differentially support the modal ontological argument rather than the reverse. And so I still think it's usefully characterized as a symmetry breaker in the modal ontological argument debate. I mean, and it does proceed from some a priori considerations, right? Like I do think that people can just see that, yeah, things in general have an explanation, right? There's a kind of intellectual repugnance at inexplicability and unintelligibility, right? That's what the majesty of reason points to. So.
Well, that's what I wanted to. Perhaps I should tell you the reason that I was asking this. I think if we can interchangeably, or if it's kind of reducible to this discussion of imperfect, that is, metaphysically contingent things requiring an explanation, or possibly having an explanation that's necessary, I wonder if we'd have to discuss objections of modal fatalism. That is to say, we might have a defeasible reason to think that, or I should say, we might have a reason to think that actually imperfect things don't have an explanation, because if they did, we'd run into modal fatalism. That is to say, I should explain this. I'm sure you're familiar with modal fatalism, Joe, but how can I best explain this? Well, let's take, okay. If it is the case that, well, I should specify for a start, when we're talking about explanation here, presumably we're talking about like full explanation, complete explanation, sufficient explanation. Reason being, for example, if we said, what's the explanation for why we're having this conversation today? I could say, well, look, I was talking to Cameron on Facebook a little while ago about this whole atheism definition, and I mentioned in passing that I'd seen you two discuss the topic, and therefore, we're here now having this discussion. Like, that doesn't seem sufficient. Like, yeah, that's part of the explanation, but I could then say, well, the thing that explains why we're here today is because I said, because somebody posted a clip of me on Twitter discussing the definition of atheism. But clearly that doesn't do it, right? We want a sufficient explanation. We need an explanation that leaves no room, that leaves no mystery, that leaves nothing explained, right? That leaves left to be explained, that leaves no ambiguity about why P instead of not P, right? So if we're looking for a full explanation or a sufficient explanation, the problem is that if you have a set of metaphysically contingent things, that is, things that could have failed to exist or be as they are, and you're supposing that these are explained by a necessary being, well, it seems to me that full explanation is the same thing as entailment. That is to say, if something fully explains something else, then it entails it. And the reason I think that is because let's assume that this were false. Let's say that P fully explains Q, but it doesn't entail Q. This would mean that we know that P is the explanation for Q, but because it doesn't entail Q, we still need an explanation as to why Q rather than not Q. It seems so. I mean, you might just agree with me on this point. I think that you might quarrel, but like, what do you think of this claim that's embedded in modal fatalism, arguments from modal fatalism, that full explanation is the same thing as entailment? And the reason that this comes up, just to complete the argument for everyone listening, and I haven't explained this very well, I think I've butchered it, you'll probably do a better job than I will, is because if full explanation is the same thing as entailment, then if contingent things are explained by a necessary thing, then they're entailed by a necessary thing. But if they're entailed by a necessary thing, then they are necessary, so they're not contingent. So a contingent thing, in other words, can't be explained by a necessary being. So the only thing that could possibly explain contingent things would be other contingent things, but that breaks the non-circularity condition. So we're left with the conclusion that contingent things, the existence of contingent things, can't be explained by something contingent, can't be explained by something necessary, and so can't be explained at all. And so the argument goes, we have reason to think that the set of contingent things that exists cannot have an explanation because it can't be necessary and it can't be contingent.
Yeah, no, I was smiling when you mentioned at the beginning when you mentioned like modal fatalism, because I actually just published a paper on modal collapse arguments in certain philosophy of religion debates, and it just came out online yesterday. So if anyone wants to check that out, it's called The Fruitful Death of Modal Collapse Arguments. Yeah, if anyone wants to check that out, you can check that out. But that's slightly. Oh, anyway, that's in a slightly other domain of philosophy of religion than this one. But yes, I think that this is a really interesting worry. And what I would say is that I don't think explanation requires contrastive explanation. So I don't think explanation requires entailment. And if we want to just say that a full explanation is going to need to be this kind of entailing explanation, then what I'll say is that we very rarely provide full explanations. And moreover, my principal possible explanation can be run in terms of non-full explanations. So there's going to be at least some kind of explanation for existential facts, all else being equal. And we get all the same modal epistemological support for that. We get all the same experiential and abductive and inductive support for it, and so on. So I think that my argument could go through just by saying they have a non-contrastive. So it could be contrastive, but all we're demanding is that they have a non-contrastive explanation. So contrastive explanation, for those who are in the audience wondering, what is he saying? So we're contrasting some fact P with why did P happen rather than not P happening. So like, why did I go to the store rather than, a boxing match with Alex or something? Or like, why did the kangaroo jump right now instead of jumping 1 second later or something like that? So we're trying to explain one thing rather than another. We're contrasting two facts. And oftentimes we do think we give perfectly legitimate explanations that don't entail their explananda. So the thing being explained. So like, why did I get a drink? Well, because I was thirsty, and the means to actualizing my desire there were like within my power and readily available. So like that doesn't strictly entail that I get a drink. I mean, some factor, some random factor could have perhaps happened in my brain, or something like that. But it still explains it, at least in part. That we're still citing factors that influence and that still remove mystery as to why I went up and got the drink. So we oftentimes rarely cite explanations that strictly entail the explananda. And moreover, I would just say, again, my argument can be run in terms of non-contrastive explanation, and all the same arguments will apply. So,
yeah, I'd have two points here.
How about Alex? Why don't you respond, and then let's do some Q&A.
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
Although, if I don't want to kind of have the last word and get off scot-free, so if perhaps there's some room for some... It depends
totally fine. Totally fine, because he also had like the first word, I guess. So...
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, it's your show. I'm just doing what I'm told. The first quarrel I would have with what you said is that you're correct that in everyday usage and in most areas of life, when we give an explanation for something, or say we give an explanation for something, we don't give a full explanation. But if pressed, right, if I asked you for an explanation, that is, I really didn't understand why this thing obtained, why it was that you got yourself a drink or whatever, and I really wanted a full explanation, like a sufficient explanation that removed the mystery of the matter. When you said I was thirsty, I could say, well, that doesn't explain it. I mean, like just because you're thirsty, what the drink just appeared or what? It's like, well, no, okay, so I was thirsty and I had access to a kettle and I turned the kettle on and the molecules did this and all this kind of stuff. Obviously, in general usage, like this would be ridiculously pedantic. There'd be no reason to expect somebody to provide this kind of explanation. But remember that with this argument, we're talking about explanation in principle, right? Like we're saying that there exists an explanation for existential facts, or there possibly exists an explanation for existential facts. I think that if we don't mean by that a full explanation, then I'm not quite sure what we're talking about. Now, that's not to say that like we would have epistemic access to that reason or to that explanation. And it might be that an imperfect explanation or an incomplete explanation would generally suffice to make people happy enough to kind of, practically get on with their lives. But as a philosophical point, if we're asserting that there exists this thing, this explanation, it seems very strange to demand with a principle that every fact P has an explanation, but not a full one. Like it explains part of why P is true, but not all of it. It seems really strange to me to say that we can have this principle that demands an explanation or demands that we at least assume that there's an explanation without reason to the contrary, but only partly. Why would it be that we require some explanation but not all? And how much of an explanation would suffice to fulfill that principle? If we accepted the PE, for instance, the strong version, the principle of explanation, that, for those listening again, the principle that all existential facts have an explanation. If I gave you like the most minimal, most absolutely fundamental explanation that just basically gave you no information, just marginally increased your understanding, you'd probably say, well, that's not the kind of explanation I was talking about when I said that an explanation exists. So you'd run into this question of how sufficient would the explanation have to be before we say, okay, that's fine. That's the level of explanation that the principle requires of everything. It seems to me that if we're talking about explanation in principle, it needs to be a full explanation, because otherwise you run into this problem of saying, if we think that P explains Q, but it doesn't entail Q, then it's the case that like it could be that P and not Q, and it could be the case that P and Q, right? Now it happens to be the case that P and Q. But if P doesn't entail Q, then we're still left with this question, why is it that P and Q rather than P and not Q? It seems to me that not being explained just means that the fact that Q is true isn't explained. There's something lacking still. And you're right, like you can just say that something, that the principle is only that something be partly explained, but then you're going to have to define like how much. Like what are we talking about? Like a 20% explanation, a 15%, 30%, 40? Like where do you place it? It seems to me completely arbitrary. And it seems to me that if you gave me a 40% explanation of why something's the case, I would just be like, well, you haven't finished explaining it. You haven't finished explaining why that's true. If I was telling off my children for coming home late, I said, why are you home late? And they just said like, oh, my shoelace was untied or something. I'd be like, I feel like there's a lot more to that story that you're not telling me. Like there's got to be more there. And they're like, well, technically that is part of the explanation because there's some story involving how their shoelace got untied and when they bent over, they got hit by a car and had to go to the hospital or stuff like. But you don't need all that. But you only need a partial explanation. Like how much of an explanation would you need? Do you see what I'm saying? It seems arbitrary. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that it's much easier to just say, well, if we're talking about an explanation, we're talking about a full explanation. And if we're talking about a full explanation, we're talking about entailment. And if we're talking about entailment from a necessary being, if a necessary being fully explains something, then it entails it. And if anything's entailed by a necessary being, it is itself necessary, undermining the idea that contingent things can be explained at all. And if we have a reason to think that contingent things the existence of all contingent things doesn't have an explanation or is immune from the PE or PPE, then like we have, in the same way that when you say that God is exempt from the PPE, because we have good separate reason to think that God should be exempt, I have good reason to think that the imperfect fact should be exempt and therefore be able to exist without an explanation, therefore not requiring or allowing even for the possibility in this case, making impossible the existence of that perfect being. I hope that makes sense to people listening. And of course to you guys.
I was gonna say that the longer you go on, the longer Joe's follow-up post on his blog is gonna be. So right now you're at like 20,000 word response, and the longer you talk, it's gonna go up and up and up. So it's probably time that we move on to some Q&A. Okay, so we actually do have a lot of questions queued up here, and I'm sure that we could talk more about this forever, but let's just change things up a little bit and go into some questions. So this one is from Obalakana King. Obakilla King. There you go. Modal ontological argument, but actus purus. Purus? You probably know how to pronounce this, Joe. Instead of maximal being. So basically he says a being in which essence equals existence intuitively seems like a symmetry breaker to the reverse ontological argument. What are your thoughts, Joe? I picked this one first, not only because it was super chat, and I wanted to thank you for sending this in as a super chat, but also because I knew it would trigger you.
Yeah, no, so actually in my video on arguments for classical theism, part 2 out of 2, I go through different ontological arguments that try to distinctively favor classical theism in relation to non-classical theism, so that they focus on God's being identical to his act of existence, or God's being purely actual. So if this person is curious, they can see that video in there. I do raise a number of criticisms thereof. But one thing that I would say is that, well, firstly, I would argue that there are a number of positive considerations that count against such views, and I've published on those. In fact, my recent paper, I outlined 2 different problems in there at the bottom of the paper in the last section for that view. But I would also say that I don't think that it functions as a symmetry breaker, because you could just say possibly there is such a purely actual being, but also possibly there is no such purely actual being. And so you're right back at the symmetry, right? So you need some kind of positive reason to think one of them is possible rather than the other. So I don't think it solves the symmetry problem.
Alex, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't think I have much to add to what Joe said. I'm actually interested as to why Joe, being an agnostic, thinks his own symmetry breaker fails. That's something that didn't even really cross my mind until we came on air. But at the same time, I feel like that might take a while to explain, and we should perhaps.
It probably won't actually. Yeah.
Yeah, no. So, well, I don't think it. Oh, there's some sense in which I think it doesn't work. There's another sense in which I think it works. So I do think this does provide some evidence for the possibility premise in the modal ontological argument. So this is some consideration that counts in favor of theism in my mind. But the reason why I remain agnostic is just because I have lots and lots of other considerations that favor naturalism, say, as well as the reverse ontological argument. So, like, there might be some considerations about the possibility of gratuitous evil or the possibility of certain horrendous evils and so on. But anyway, my point is, I do think that the symmetry breaker, my symmetry breaker, succeeds. Right. It's just that defeasible aspect comes in. So I have kind of counterbalancing evidence.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and he does that with a lot of things. That's why he's agnostic. I know Joe so well. Trust me, guys. Okay, so from Maverick Christian, he just sent this in as a super chat. Thanks, Wade. He says, question, could indeterministic causation be a complete explanation on Alex's view?
Well, again, like I'd want an example of indeterministic causation. I mean, I know, for instance, Alexander Proust discusses exactly the question that we're talking about, and tries to give some examples of things which are, causally adequate, but don't entail. But his examples include things like probabilistic explanations, which I think are troublesome for certain reasons, but also the existence of free will. For instance, he thinks that something can be caused. There's an explanation for why we commit certain actions, but clearly there can't be an entailment there because otherwise it wouldn't be free. I don't believe in free will, so that doesn't work for me either. Indeterministic causation. I mean, what kind of examples are we talking about? Like can we? What do you mean by indeterministic causation? Like, I don't know. Well,
I'll see if he can. I'll see if he can follow up in the live chat. So Wade, go ahead, Joe.
I I could probably, well, so by indeterministic causation, I just think that he means that the total set of causal conditions relevant don't strictly entail the effect coming about. So it's consistent that the cause C obtain and yet the effect E not obtain. So possibly it is the case that C and not E. So that's what I take it to mean, indeterministic causation, that the cause doesn't necessitate or determine or strictly entail its effect. Now, I myself do think that could potentially serve as an adequate well, I don't think it could satisfy Alex's complete explanation or full explanation, because that's going to be a contrastive explanation. And in indeterministic causation, you're not going to be able to have a contrastive explanation, precisely because there's no entailment link there. There's no explanation that fully removes mystery as to why one of the probabilistic outcomes obtains rather than the other, because there's nothing in the cause across worlds that you can point to differentially account for that. But I still think that you could at least give. You don't have to say like, oh, well, it's a 20% explanation or a 15% explanation. You could still give a reasonably adequate explanation that helps illuminate why the effect comes about. I mean, if I say that God freely created the universe for a given reason because it was really good, and since he's perfect, he desires to bring about good things, that, although it doesn't strictly entail that this universe comes about because God could have created another universe, say, that's good, it does still seem to at least remove some mystery as to why that's the case. And so I still think it could amount to some kind of adequate explanation. And when Alex, when you were giving your example, right, you were talking about how well, what if your daughter just said, oh, well, I mean, my shoe was untied, that's why I'm late. I mean, yeah, it's part of an explanation, but like, imagine that she told you, oh, there's no explanation at all, it was utterly inexplicable. I think you'd be even more like mystified at that. You'd be like, no, that's even more absurd than if you at least cited some kind of explanatory factor. And I think that clues us in to the plausibility of my PPE, because it's at least more plausible that there's some explanation than that there's utterly inexplicable.
Unless, of course, but bear in mind that this kind of, your argument relies on the fact that such facts as her shoelace being untied is an imperfect fact, or a metaphysically contingent fact. If my daughter was sufficiently philosophically inclined, I might say, well, look, if you actually were to give me a full explanation, there is a full explanation out there, and if there is, then it would actually be a deterministic explanation, and therefore, isn't this interesting that I actually can't blame you for being late, because it turns out that it was necessarily the case that you'd be late, because ultimately anything explained by a necessary being must itself be necessary, or something like this. Like, I mean, I don't think, I'm trying to think about the precise wording of the question and whether I would just have to deny that there are such things as indeterministic causes. And I think I'd probably be on board with that, at least as it seems to me. I need to think about it more. It seems to me the case that if you have something which causes something else, but doesn't entail it or doesn't determine it to be the case, then you've basically just got a partial explanation, a partial cause. You don't have a fully sufficient cause, because if you had a fully sufficient cause, it would be sufficient to bring it about. I think I would just deny the existence of indeterministic causation. I'm sure there are examples out there, but I just really can't. I mean, I would use like determination and causation essentially interchangeably, but that's a product of my broader metaphysics, which might be wrong, but I think I'd be committed to that view with the views I currently hold.
So do you guys mind if we move on to another question?
Yeah, let's go to another question. It's cool.
Okay, so before we do that, I would be remiss, I think that's the right way to say this, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Alex is going to be with us in person, live, at our CCV1, our first conference. And let me go ahead and just put the little thing, the graphic on the screen. So it's August 26th to the 28th, in-person conference. And these are the list of speakers, if you're interested in attending: Josh Rasmussen, Luke Barnes, Cy Gart, Lee Strobel, Liz Jackson, Trent Horn, Alex O'Connor, and Braxton Hunter. There's been a slight change in the program. So instead of Braxton hunting Alex, instead of Braxton debating Alex, it's going to be a debate between Alex and Trent. And so that's just the only change there. But I would love to see you guys there in person. And as I mentioned, Alex will be there with us. He'll also be on the panel at the very end of the conference, answering questions and everything. So it's going to be an awesome conference. Hope to see you guys there. Just visit the website if you're interested in attending. So with that, here's the next question. This one is from Daniel Barrios, and he asked us earlier. He also sent in a super chat. So thanks for that, Daniel. He says, Question for Alex: would you find yourself believing the infinite regress idea to be more plausible, or the idea of a necessary unmoved mover? Honestly and genuinely, which do you find more plausible?
If you're talking about the infinite regress we were talking about earlier, as pertains to knowledge, then I definitely think. Let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. I think the question is asking if I find it more plausible to accept the existence of an infinite regress than the existence of a necessary unmoved mover, which says to me that you're not talking about the infinite regress of knowledge that we were talking about earlier, but rather just an infinite regress of causes. I don't know. Like, this is the thing. I remain in a kind of passive agnostic atheism, in that it seems to me intuitively implausible that there can be such thing as an infinite regress of causes. But I think, like, the idea of a necessary unmoved mover has problems too. I think, like, we generally, there are certain rules that we apply, like non-circularity, that it may be the case that contingent things are explained by other contingent things or something like this. It seems very unintuitive to me. But like, I don't, if you push me on it, I think it's probably more intuitive. It seems definitely more intuitive to me that there is some kind of terminus to an infinite regress, rather than there can exist some kind of infinite causal regress. Like, I would admit that seems more intuitive, but I think that most of philosophy consists in reevaluating such intuitions to see if they're actually rationally warranted. But yeah, like, I think at a base level, the idea that without an unmoved mover, you've essentially got an infinite regress of causes, and that can't exist for reasons of paradox, and but for the paradoxes that it raises, I think that's potentially more plausible. But I should stress that the agnostic atheism that I currently possess is quite unlike the one that I had maybe 4 years ago. Beforehand, it was very much the case that I essentially would have said, like, there aren't really any good reasons to think that God exists, or at least those reasons that have been put forward, I think, don't work. Now, and that is to say, I was sat on the fence, because there was just no breeze. There was just no breeze to push me onto one side. I was just sat there. Now I'm still sat on the fence. I'm still an agnostic atheist of some description, but now it's more like there are equally forceful breezes pushing in opposite directions, right? So I do think that the contingency argument for the existence of God is a strong one. I do think that certain ontological arguments, if there are certain quarrels like the one we're having now, can be resolved, like, is a good argument. It's at least a good attempt to prove the existence of God. I think that the idea of an infinite regress probably does lead to unacceptable paradoxes. And so I would say that on its own, yes, like, I think there's good reason to think that there is a necessary unmoved mover. However, now the agnosticism is that that's the breeze pushing in one direction, but there's also now I've been more I've thought a lot more and a lot more deeply about the breezes that would go in the opposite direction, involving the problem of evil or divine hiddenness or animal suffering in particular, and these kinds of things. The potential paradoxes involved in a necessary being, arguments about modal fatalism, for instance, that we were just talking about, that now push me in the other direction. So on its own, yeah, I do find more plausible on a surface level the idea of a necessary unmoved mover than the idea of an infinite regress of causes. If you asked about it in isolation, I would say so.
So, Joe, don't say anything in response to that, because I think we've actually got to close it out. I want to respect Alex's time. But then also, here's the last question that I want to get to, and then we'll close it out. From Al Fukran, and I think, actually, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this, and I feel like I say that every time I actually put up anything. So, anyways, his question is, what kind of bear is best? Not everyone at once.
I wish I could remember. I've just been rewatching The U.S. Office, and I'm sure that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do neither of you know what this is from? Joe probably doesn't, because he doesn't watch TV at all.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say Gummy Bear.
Oh my gosh. No, it's an Office
I can't remember
quote.
how it goes. I'm British.
Dwight.
What do you expect from me? I can't quote that show.
So Jim is impersonating Dwight on the show in this quote, and he goes, he says to Dwight, he goes, "Which bear is best?" And then Dwight responds and says something like, "Well, that depends. There's basically two schools of thought." And then Jim says, "False. Black bear," something like that. Anyways, my wife and I love that show. We watch it just on repeat all the time. So I had to ask it. So thanks for sending that in. Okay, well, why don't we just take? I know Alex, you've got to go, but why don't we take just a couple minutes, close this thing out, and wrap it up? So I know Alex just got done talking, but I'm gonna pass it back over to you, Alex. Share some of your thoughts about the dialogue today, and then we'll close it out with Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think once the paper is available in print, people should read it because Joe kind of anticipates and responds to a lot of objections, including some that we've spoken about today, but also ones that we didn't. Worth reading. I think it's an admirable attempt to break the symmetry. I feel as though, it was a bit because it took quite a long time to lay it out. We spent a lot of time talking about the MOA generally. It takes quite a while to explain the whole paper, and I feel as though I spent more time kind of offering reasons to think that the possibly God doesn't exist premise is plausible, rather than specifically addressing your reason to think that the possibly God does exist premise is reasonable. So I feel like I may have kind of derailed things a little bit there from what was expected, but I hope it's still been somewhat fruitful. And you're also right to say that the considerations about modal fatalism really more apply to arguments from contingency that rely on the PSR rather than the symmetry breaker that you put forward. Strictly speaking, I think it might be kind of embedded into it, but I mean, it's been fun. We've talked about a lot of different things, but yeah, I mean, I feel as though I could have spent a little bit more time discussing some of the objections that you raised in your paper. It's a shame that I didn't get around to it, but yeah, no, I mean, I had fun. It's been good.
It is what it is. I mean, yeah, conversations like this. That's kind of why I was like, Joe sent me like a list of how we should like start this, and I was like, bro, if you do all that, and we're not even gonna like start to have the conversation until like an hour in, just because there's like so much to talk about. But Joe, go ahead and.
I mean, you could have done a whole episode just laying out the thesis in the first place, I think.
Which there's stuff already out. Joe, have you done a video on that where you just kind of like talk about the dialectic?
Once it's published. Once it's published, I'm gonna do a full blown video on it, like one of my lecture videos. So super fun.
Oh, nice.
I love those. Yeah.
Cool.
But okay. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was really fruitful, and I really liked the various avenues that we explored, like the knowledge one, the infinite regress, the modal fatalism, trying to break the symmetry in the other direction. I thought this was super duper fun, and I hope just people benefit from it, and I hope that it serves them. So I liked it. It was super duper fun.
So one last question: if you guys could both recommend one resource on the ontological argument, what would it be? I know that I just kind of threw that out there.
I think it depends on who you're like targeting here. I think that the best place to start with the ontological argument might genuinely be the SEP entry by Graham Oppy. Like that. I mean, that's obviously Graham Oppy has an entire book on ontological arguments. That's
by SEP.
Worth reading for the interested reader.
We've thrown out about 50 different acronyms today. Yeah, the SCP is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's an amazing website.
It's just fantastic. I mean, it's wonderful for anybody studying philosophy, even if you are, or like I was, that is, at an actual university with access to a real library. I spent more time on the SCP than anywhere else. It's a fantastic resource, and as I say, it's Graham Oppy who authored the entry. And I think it's a good place to start. So if that's what you mean, like for somebody who's kind of just the general interested reader who wants to learn about the ontological argument, I definitely recommend starting there, especially because the SEP can also be used as a directory. If you look at the footnotes, if one of the arguments, one of the considerations takes your fancy, you can just go right down to the bottom and find out where you can find further reading. So it's a good kind of landing page in many ways as well. So that's where I'd point people to in the first instance.
So what about you, Joe?
Yeah, so that was actually going to be one of my, I know you said only one, but that was going to be one of my recommendations. That is a little bit technical. So it's still a somewhat technical book, but it's much more understandable than lots of other ones. It's Tyron Goldschmidt's, you might have had him on your channel. I don't know if you have. Yeah, but I've also had him on my channel. He's been on other channels. But yeah, his book, Ontological Arguments, it's in the Cambridge Elements series, and so it's really small. You can read it in like an afternoon at the beach. It is so good. I loved it so much. It's so clear. It's such a good book. It's cheap because it's super short, and it's like an intro to like the whole debate. yeah, I recommend everyone get that. And I mean, I had him on my channel to discuss the book as well. It's something like Ontological Arguments with Tyron Goldschmidt. So if you want to look at a video on it as well, you could check out that. But yeah.
There you go. That's actually a good segue into just letting you guys know one more time. Go check out their channels if you don't know, or if you're not already subscribed to Alex, Cosmic Skeptic, or to Joe, Majesty of Reason. Yeah, go check out their channels, linked for your convenience in the description of this video. And we will see you in the next video, actually happening in just a couple days. So I hope to see you there live, but until next time. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?